Welcome to the Dark Ledger, where history's darkest secrets are finally revealed. She entered the world wrapped in privilege so complete that it felt indistinguishable from destiny. From the moment she could walk the wide corridors of her family's Virginia estate, she was taught, subtly and relentlessly, that she belonged above others. The plantation was not simply where she lived, it was the foundation of her identity, a vast and self-contained universe governed by her family's name. White pillars rose at the front of the house like declarations of permanence, and behind them stretched acres of fertile land worked by enslaved people whose labor sustained every comfort she enjoyed. This arrangement was never presented to her as cruel or temporary. It was described as tradition, as order, as the natural structure of the world. By the time she was old enough to understand words like ownership and inheritance, they had already fused with her sense of self. Her childhood unfolded in a carefully curated environment designed to shape her into a perfect Southern lady. Tutors instructed her in reading, writing, music, and scripture, while her mother corrected her posture, her speech, and her emotional displays. Strength was acceptable only when it appeared as composure. Authority was admirable so long as it was exercised gracefully. She learned how to smile without revealing too much, how to command without raising her voice, and how to expect obedience as effortlessly as breathing. When enslaved women dressed her hair or fastened the buttons on her gowns, she rarely met their eyes, not out of malice, but because the system around her had taught her not to see them as equals capable of mutual recognition. They were fixtures in her life, present yet invisible, essential yet unacknowledged. As she grew older, the plantation became both her kingdom and her cage. She was free to roam the grounds, to ride horses beneath open skies, to host gatherings that filled the house with laughter and candlelight. Yet every freedom she enjoyed existed within strict boundaries set by her gender and class. She was reminded constantly that her ultimate purpose was to marry well, to preserve the family name, and to maintain appearances. Any deviation from these expectations would reflect not only on her, but on generations before her. This pressure created a quiet tension within her, a need to assert control in the areas where control was allowed. On the plantation, that control was nearly absolute. The enslaved people who lived and worked there experienced her authority in countless small ways. A glance could signal approval or displeasure. A brief word could alter the rhythm of someone's entire day. She prided herself on being measured rather than cruel, believing that restraint made her morally superior to harsher masters. Among her peers, she was often praised as refined and fair-minded, a woman who understood how to rule without descending into vulgar brutality. This praise reinforced her self-image and allowed her to avoid confronting the deeper violence inherent in owning another human being. To her, kindness meant moderation, not justice, and she accepted this distinction without question. Socially, she flourished. Invitations to dinners, balls, and church gatherings filled her calendar, and she navigated these spaces with confidence earned through years of observation and practice. Conversations were a delicate dance of politeness and subtext, where alliances were formed and rivalries quietly acknowledged. She was keenly aware of her position and guarded it carefully. Reputation was everything, and she learned to protect hers with the same vigilance her family used to protect their land. Any hint of scandal could be disastrous, not because of moral failing, but because of social consequence. This awareness sharpened her instincts and made her both charming and calculating. Friendships, particularly with other women of her class, became a refuge from the pressures she faced. With them, she could speak more freely, share frustrations, and feel understood in ways that men rarely offered. These relationships were intense, built on shared experiences of privilege and constraint. Loyalty was expected, even demanded, and betrayal, real or perceived, cut deeply. She invested emotionally in these bonds, perhaps more than she realized, because they affirmed her identity and her sense of belonging in a world that constantly evaluated her worth. Beneath her polished exterior, however, lay a growing restlessness. She sensed that her life, for all its comfort and admiration, was strangely hollow. The days blurred together, marked by routines that left little room for genuine fulfillment. Yet instead of questioning the system that produced this emptiness, she internalized it as a personal failing that needed to be corrected through greater control and affirmation. Power became her remedy. The more firmly she asserted her authority, the more secure she felt. This dynamic shaped not only how she ruled her plantation, but how she approached relationships, viewing them through a lens of possession and dominance. The institution of slavery played a central role in reinforcing this worldview. It normalized the idea that people could be owned, shared, and used according to the desires of those in power. Boundaries that might have existed in another moral framework were blurred or erased entirely. Within this context, the heiress learned to see human lives as extensions of her will. The law supported her, society affirmed her, and religion often justified her actions. Any discomfort she felt was easily silenced by the chorus of voices telling her she was right, that this was how things had always been and how they were meant to remain. As she approached adulthood, marriage loomed as both an expectation and a threat. Suitors expressed interest, drawn by her wealth, her beauty, and her family's influence. Each proposal was weighed carefully, not in terms of affection but advantage. She hesitated, aware that marriage would require her to relinquish some measure of control to a husband. This prospect unsettled her. She had spent her life commanding others, and the idea of submission, even within socially sanctioned bounds, felt constricting. Remaining unmarried, at least for the moment, allowed her to maintain her autonomy and her authority, though it also fueled gossip and speculation. The plantation continued to thrive, a testament to the efficiency of its operations and the suffering that made that efficiency possible. From the outside, it appeared orderly and prosperous, a model of Southern success. Inside, it was a place of constant tension, where fear and obedience underpinned every interaction between master and enslaved. The heiress moved through this environment with confidence, rarely forced to confront the human cost of her comfort. When she did, she turned away, choosing the familiar safety of denial over the discomfort of empathy. This was the world that shaped her character, a world that rewarded entitlement and concealed cruelty behind manners and tradition. Every lesson she absorbed reinforced the belief that she was entitled to more loyalty, more admiration, more control. She could not imagine a future in which her desires were denied or her authority challenged in a meaningful way. That sense, invulnerability, cultivated over years of unchecked power, became the most dangerous aspect of her identity. Long before jealousy, obsession, or violence entered her story, the conditions for tragedy were already firmly in place. They existed in the quiet assumptions of her upbringing, in the normalized injustice of her daily life, and in the emotional void she attempted to fill with control. At this stage, she was still admired, still secure, still untouched by scandal. Yet beneath the surface of elegance and privilege, something unstable was growing, waiting for the right circumstances to bring it fully into the light. The friendship began innocently enough, as most dangerous things do, wrapped in warmth, familiarity, and the comforting illusion of trust. The other young woman entered the heiress's life through the narrow social channels of Virginia's elite, where families of similar standing gravitated toward one another out of habit as much as strategy. They were introduced at a gathering where polite smiles masked quiet evaluations, and from that first evening there was a sense of recognition between them. Each saw in the other a reflection of her own life, privilege balanced by expectation, freedom limited by gender, power granted in some spaces and denied in others. What started as courteous companionship soon deepened into something more intense, a bond forged through shared confidences and mutual understanding. They spent long afternoons together walking the plantation grounds, parasols tilted against the sun, their conversations drifting easily from trivial gossip to private frustrations. With each passing week, the walls they kept up for the rest of society lowered in one another's presence. They spoke of loneliness, of the suffocating pressure to be perfect, of the strange contradiction of being both powerful and constrained. In each other, they found validation. The heiress admired her friend's boldness, her willingness to speak candidly, while the friend admired the heiress's authority, her confidence, and the security her wealth provided. The admiration was mutual, but it was also uneven, subtly imbalanced in ways neither fully acknowledged at first. As their closeness grew, so did their sense of exclusivity. They began to see their friendship as something rare and special, set apart from other relationships. This exclusivity bred a quiet possessiveness, expressed not in open conflict, but in subtle gestures, lingering glances when one spoke to others too warmly, pointed remarks disguised as jokes, moments of silence that carried unspoken meaning. They reassured each other often of their loyalty, as if repeating it could ward off the possibility of betrayal. In a society that demanded restraint, their friendship became a space where emotions ran freer, where intensity was not only allowed but encouraged. The plantation, with its isolation and rigid hierarchies, amplified this dynamic. Removed from broader scrutiny, the two women inhabited a world where their desires and decisions went largely unchecked. Enslaved people moved quietly around them, ever present yet voiceless, reinforcing the sense that the women's inner lives were the only ones that mattered. Over time, this environment fostered a dangerous blurring of boundaries. What was shared conversation became shared secrecy, what was mutual support became mutual indulgence. They began to test limits, emboldened by the belief that their status shielded them from consequence. It was within this context that the arrangement that would later haunt them took shape, not as a single shocking decision, but as a gradual erosion of moral restraint. The idea emerged in fragments, hinted at rather than declared, shaped by insinuation and unspoken agreement. The enslave. D-Man at the center of it was already part of the heiress's household, his presence so normalized that his humanity had long been eclipsed by his utility. To both women he existed less as an individual than as a symbol of their power, a living testament to the control they wielded. In their minds, involving him further did not feel like crossing a line so much as extending a privilege they already possessed. At first, there was hesitation, masked by nervous laughter and careful phrasing. They reassured each other that no harm would come, that everything would remain discreet, that their bond justified this shared secret. The heiress, accustomed to ownership, framed the arrangement as generous, even companionable, while her friend, drawn by both curiosity and envy, accepted these assurances eagerly. Neither paused to consider the imbalance of power that made true consent impossible. The system they lived under had long absolved them of that responsibility. What followed tightened the bond between them while simultaneously planting the seeds of its destruction. Sharing such a secret created an intoxicating sense of intimacy, a feeling that they were united against the world. Yet it also introduced comparison, competition, and unspoken hierarchies into their relationship. Small differences in attention or perceived favor began to matter more than either wanted to admit. Each gesture, each moment, was scrutinized for meaning. What had once been solidarity slowly shifted into rivalry, though it remained buried beneath affectionate words and practiced smiles. The heiress, who had always been accustomed to being at the center, felt a flicker of unease when she sensed her friend growing too confident, too comfortable within the boundaries of her world. The friend, in turn, felt both gratitude and resentment. Gratitude for being included in something so private, resentment at the constant reminder that it was not truly hers. These conflicting emotions coexisted uneasily, feeding a tension that neither woman was prepared to confront honestly. Instead, they doubled down on the language of loyalty, insisting on their closeness even as it began to strain. Their conversations grew sharper, tinged with subtle tests of dominance. Compliments carried an edge, and moments of silence stretched longer than before. They reassured each other repeatedly that nothing could come between them, yet the very need for such reassurances hinted at the fragility beneath. Each woman believed she understood the other completely, yet both were blind to the depth of their own possessiveness. The friendship that had once offered comfort now demanded constant maintenance, sustained by secrecy and control rather than trust. The enslaved man, though rarely spoken of directly, became an unspoken axis around which their emotions revolved. His presence intensified their connection while also exposing its faults. He was a reminder of the power they shared and the power that divided them. Neither woman acknowledged his perspective, his fear, or his lack of agency. Doing so would have disrupted the narrative they had constructed for themselves. Instead, they treated the situation as an extension of their bond, something that belonged to them alone. As time passed, the weight of the secret began to press in on them. What had once felt thrilling now carried an undercurrent of anxiety. They worried about discovery, about gossip, about the fragile balance they were trying to maintain. This fear did not bring them closer, it made them more guarded, more suspicious of each other's reactions. Every perceived slight felt magnified, every disagreement loaded with implications far beyond the surface issue. Their friendship, once defined by ease, became charged and volatile. Still, neither was willing to step back. To do so would have meant admitting fault, acknowledging that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. It was easier to cling to the belief that they were in control, that their bond was strong enough to withstand anything. This belief was reinforced by years of living without meaningful consequences, by a society that excused their excesses and overlooked their transgressions. They had learned that rules were flexible for people like them, and so they assumed they always would be. What they failed to see was how deeply jealousy had already embedded itself in their relationship, how it had transformed affection into competition and trust into suspicion. The dangerous bond they had forged was no longer just between two friends, it was entangled with power, ownership, and ego in ways that made collapse inevitable. By the time either woman sensed the full extent of what they had set in motion, the friendship had become something else entirely, an unstable alliance balanced precariously between devotion and destruction, waiting only for the smallest spark to ignite its darkest potential. He existed in their world as both presence and absence, seen constantly yet rarely acknowledged as fully human. From the moment he was brought into the household, his life had been defined by obedience learned through fear, by silence practiced for survival. The routines of the plantation trained him to anticipate commands before they were spoken, to read moods in the slightest shift of posture or tone. He understood that his safety depended not on fairness or law, but on the unpredictable temperaments of those who owned him. Over time, this awareness shaped every thought, every movement, until caution became instinct and self-erasure a form of protection. Caught between two powerful women, his existence grew even more precarious. Their AT&T engine, which might have seemed a privilege from the outside, functioned instead as a tightening snare. He learned quickly that pleasing one could anger the other, that neutrality was impossible in a dynamic built on possession and rivalry. Each interaction carried hidden risks, and he navigated them with the quiet calculation of someone who knew that a single misstep could alter his fate. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he moved, storing impressions he could never safely voice. The psychological toll was immense. Living under constant scrutiny eroded any sense of self he had managed to preserve. He became hyper-aware of how he was perceived, adjusting his behavior to match whatever version of him seemed least likely to provoke displeasure. This constant performance left him exhausted, hollowed out by the effort of surviving without ever truly living. Nights brought little relief. Sleep was shallow and uneasy, haunted by the knowledge that morning would return him to the same impossible balance. Powerlessness shaped his understanding of the world. He knew that the law recognized him not as a person but as property, and that this designation stripped him of any claim to justice. Appeals to mercy were unpredictable at best, dangerous at worst. He had seen others punished for far less, their suffering treated as routine, their pain absorbed into the background noise of plantation life. These memories informed every decision he made, reinforcing the lesson that endurance, not resistance, was the safest path. The two women rarely considered his inner life, yet their emotions shaped it profoundly. Their moods fluctuated, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, often charged with tension he could feel even when he did not understand its source. When their friendship felt secure, the atmosphere around him seemed calmer, though never safe. When cracks appeared, in them the air grew heavy with unspoken threat. He sensed that he had become a symbol within their relationship, an object onto which they projected desire, jealousy, and control. This realization deepened his fear because symbols are easily sacrificed when conflicts escalate. Isolation compounded his suffering. Though he lived among other enslaved people, the nature of his position separated him from them. He could not share his experiences openly without risking suspicion or punishment. Silence became a barrier not only between him and his owners, but between him and those who might have understood his pain. In moments of stolen solitude, he clung to fragments of memory, songs half-remembered, faces from a time before the plantation, fleeting reminders that he had once been more than what he was now allowed to be. The imbalance of power left no room for refusal, no space for consent. Every demand, however it was framed, carried the weight of ownership behind it. He understood that compliance did not guarantee safety, but resistance almost certainly guaranteed harm. This grim calculus governed his choices, forcing him to participate in situations that deepened his sense of violation while offering no path to escape. Over time, the boundaries of his own will blurred, eroded by the constant necessity of submission. Emotionally, he existed in a state of suspended dread. He learned to read the women's interactions with each other, noting subtle shifts that might signal danger. A raised eyebrow, a tightened smile, a silence that lingered too long. These small details took on outsized significance. He feared becoming the catalyst for a conflict he could neither control nor survive. This fear was not abstract, it was grounded in lived experience, reinforced by the knowledge that when powerful people turned on each other, those beneath them often paid the price. Yet within this constrained existence, traces of humanity persisted. He felt anger, though he buried it deep. He felt sorrow, though he had no safe outlet for it. He felt a longing for dignity, for a life not defined by fear and manipulation. These emotions did not disappear simply because they were dangerous. They retreated inward, forming a quiet core of resistance that sustained him even as it threatened to break him. Holding on to these feelings was risky, but letting them go entirely would have meant surrendering the last fragments of himself. The women's rivalry intensified his vulnerability. When jealousy surfaced, it often manifested indirectly through sharper commands or sudden shifts in expectation. He could feel himself being measured, compared, used as leverage in an unspoken contest. This objectification stripped away any illusion that he mattered as a person. He mattered only insofar as he could satisfy needs or provoke reactions. Recognizing this truth was devastating, but it also clarified the nature of his captivity. He was not merely enslaved by law, he was trapped within the emotional entanglements of those who held power over him. Fear shaped his interactions, but it did not erase his awareness. He understood that the arrangement binding the two women together was unstable, built on secrecy and unequal desire. He sensed that when it collapsed, the consequences would be severe. This awareness haunted him, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety. He tried to remain invisible, to minimize his presence, but invisibility was impossible in a situation where his very existence had become central to another's obsession. The plantation offered no refuge. Its familiar rhythms, work at dawn, meals at set hours, enforced rest, continued as if nothing were amiss, creating a surreal contrast between outward normalcy and inner turmoil. He moved through these routines mechanically, his body performing tasks while his mind remained vigilant, scanning for signs of danger. This split between action and awareness became a coping mechanism, a way to survive without fully engaging with the pain of his reality. Over time, the strain began to show. Fatigue dulled his reactions, and moments of inattention became more frequent. Each lapse terrified him because he knew how quickly mistakes could be punished. The constant effort to remain composed under pressure drained him, leaving little energy for hope. Yet hope persisted, fragile and irrational, in the belief that circumstances might change, that the tension consuming the household might resolve itself without destroying him in the process. He could not know how the story would end, only that it was moving towards something darker. The air around him felt charged, as if the plantation itself sensed the impending rupture. In this charged space, he existed as both witness and victim, forced to endure a conflict rooted in power and jealousy that denied his humanity at every turn. His suffering remained largely unseen, absorbed into the shadows of a system designed to render it invisible. By the time events reached their breaking point, his inner world had been shaped irrevocably by fear, silence, and endurance. He had learned the cost of being trapped between two mistresses, where every path led toward harm and survival meant sacrificing pieces of oneself day by day. Though history might later remember the scandal, the jealousy, and the violence, his experience would remain largely unrecorded. Another life constrained and scarred by a system that allowed such cruelty to flourish unchecked. Jealousy did not arrive suddenly or announce itself with dramatic gestures. It crept in quietly, disguised as concern, curiosity, and wounded pride. At first, it was little more than a sensation. Each woman struggled to name, a tightening in the chest when the other laughed too freely, a flicker of irritation when attention seemed unevenly distributed. They dismissed these feelings as temporary, blaming fatigue or stress, refusing to acknowledge that something corrosive had begun to take hold. Yet jealousy has a way of feeding on denial, growing stronger in the shadows where it is least examined. The heiress felt it first as a disruption to her sense of order. She had always been the axis around which relationships turned, the unquestioned center of her world. Now she sensed a shift, subtle but unmistakable. Her friend moved with greater confidence, spoke with a tone that hinted at entitlement rather than gratitude. What unsettled the heiress most was not the change itself, but what it implied, that something she considered hers could inspire loyalty or attention independent of her control. This challenged a lifetime of assumptions about ownership and hierarchy, and the discomfort it caused quickly hardened into resentment. Her friend experienced jealousy differently, shaped by a mixture of desire and insecurity. Inclusion in the heiress's private world had been intoxicating, a validation of her worth and status. But that inclusion came with constant reminders of imbalance. She was allowed access, not equality, participation, not authority. Each moment of perceived favoritism toward the heiress reignited old insecurities, transforming admiration into envy. She began to scrutinize every interaction, searching for signs that she was being sidelined or taken for granted. What she found, or believed she found, confirmed her fears, fueling a growing obsession with proving her importance. Their conversations grew charged with subtext. Words that once comforted now cut, their meanings sharpened by suspicion. Compliments sounded condescending, reassurances felt hollow. They tested each other constantly, pushing boundaries to see how far they could go without provoking open conflict. These tests rarely brought satisfaction. Instead, they intensified the very emotions they were meant to soothe. Each woman felt wronged, misunderstood, yet convinced of her own righteousness. Neither recognized how deeply they had begun to mirror one another, locked in a cycle of accusation and defensiveness. Possession became the unspoken language of their rivalry. The heiress asserted her dominance through reminders of status and authority, subtle references to ownership that reinforced the hierarchy she depended on. Her friend countered with emotional claims, emphasizing shared secrets and mutual vulnerability, insisting on a bond that transcended property and power. These competing claims could not coexist peacefully. Each implied the invalidation of the other, and so every interaction became a negotiation, a struggle for control disguised as intimacy. As jealousy intensified, so did their need to win. Winning did not always mean triumph in an obvious sense. Often, it meant reassurance that the other was still dependent, still secondary. This need drove them to increasingly reckless behavior, pushing situations beyond what either had originally intended. They justified these escalations by framing them as responses to provocation, convincing themselves that the other had forced their hand. Responsibility was always externalized, blame always assigned elsewhere. The enslaved man at the center of their conflict became the clearest measure of this rivalry. Attention toward him was no longer incidental, it was strategic. Each woman watched closely how the other interacted with him, interpreting gestures and silences as evidence of betrayal or dominance. He was transformed fully into a symbol, a contested object through which they sought validation. His fear and discomfort went unnoticed, eclipsed by the drama of their own emotions. In their eyes, his reactions mattered only insofar as they reflected favor or rejection. Their jealousy soon spilled into other areas of life. Social interactions became fraught, as each woman wondered what the other might reveal or conceal. Trust eroded rapidly. They guarded their words in public while dissecting them in private, replaying conversations again and again in search of hidden meanings. Sleep became restless, minds crowded with imagined slights and rehearsed confrontations. The emotional energy once devoted to friendship now fueled obsession, leaving little room for reason or restraint. Attempts at reconciliation only deepened the damage. When they tried to address the tension, the conversations quickly devolved into accusations. Each apology came with conditions, each expression of hurt met with defensiveness. They spoke of loyalty while actively undermining it, clinging to the idea of their bond even as their actions corroded it. These moments ended not with resolution, but with temporary truces, fragile pauses in a conflict that had no clear endpoint. Pride played a decisive role in this escalation. Neither woman could tolerate the idea of yielding, of admitting vulnerability or fault. For the heiress, conceding ground felt like a threat to her authority and identity. For her friend, it felt like a confirmation of inferiority she could not bear. Pride transformed jealousy into obsession, narrowing their perspectives until the conflict consumed their thoughts. Everything became evidence, everything a potential weapon. The environment around them reinforced this descent. Their social world discouraged introspection and rewarded dominance, offering no language for accountability. Excesses were excused as passions, transgressions softened by status. This lack of external restraint allowed their rivalry to intensify unchecked. They had grown accustomed to lives without consequence, and this belief emboldened them to push further, convinced that whatever happened could be managed, concealed, or explained away. As the balance between them collapsed, fear joined jealousy, amplifying its effects. Each woman feared losing control over the situation, over her reputation, over the narrative that defined her. This fear drove preemptive strikes, sharper words, calculated gestures, deliberate provocations designed to assert dominance before the other could. These actions deepened the divide, confirming the worst suspicions on both sides and eliminating any remaining goodwill. Emotionally, they became trapped in a closed system, feeding off one another's reactions. Anger provoked defensiveness. Defensiveness provoked escalation. Moments of clarity were brief and easily dismissed, drowned out by the need to be right, to be superior. The possibility of walking away, of dismantling the arrangement entirely, seemed unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because it threatened the identities they had constructed around power and possession. The plantation itself seemed to absorb this tension, its routines continuing amid an atmosphere thick with unspoken hostility. Servants sensed the change, moving more cautiously, aware that volatility at the top often translated into suffering below. The women, however, were too consumed by their conflict to notice these ripples. Their focus narrowed until only their rivalry remained, eclipsing empathy and judgment alike. By the time jealousy fully transformed into obsession, it had rewritten their understanding of reality. Each believed she was defending herself against an aggressor, protecting what was rightfully hers. Compassion had been replaced by calculation, affection by suspicion. They stood poised, at a breaking point, driven not by reason but by the relentless logic of jealousy that demanded resolution at any cost. In this state, violence no longer seemed unthinkable, it appeared, to their distorted perceptions, as a possible solution, a way to end the torment and reclaim control. What neither woman grasped was that obsession offers no true victory. It consumes indiscriminately, destroying the very things it seeks to protect. As jealousy tightened its grip, it pushed them toward actions that would forever alter their lives and the lives of those caught in their wake. The stage was set for catastrophe, not through a single moment of madness, but through a slow, deliberate surrender to obsession that had stripped away restraint, empathy, and ultimately, humanity itself. The moment everything unraveled did not come with thunder or spectacle, but with a quiet finality that felt almost unreal. The household moved through its routines that day as it always had, servants stepping carefully, voices lowered, eyes averted. Beneath this veneer of normalcy, tension coiled tightly, stretched to its limit. Both women carried the weight of sleepless nights and unresolved fury, each convinced that she stood on the brink of losing something essential: control, dignity, dominance. When they finally confronted one another, it was not planned, yet it felt inevitable, as though every step they had taken over the preceding months had been guiding them toward this collision. Words were exchanged first, sharp and deliberate, each sentence crafted to wound. Accusations surfaced that had long simmered beneath polite denials, each woman revealing how deeply she believed herself betrayed. The heiress spoke from a place of authority and entitlement, invoking ownership, hierarchy, and gratitude owed. Her friend responded with equal intensity, rejecting subservience, insisting on shared sacrifice and mutual claim. Their voices rose and fell, echoing through rooms accustomed to restraint, startling those who overheard fragments and quickly retreated. What had once been concealed beneath civility now stood exposed, raw and dangerous. As the argument escalated, reason slipped further from reach. Pride and obsession dictated their reactions, narrowing their focus until there was no room for compromise. Each saw the other not as a friend, but as a rival who had overstepped, threatened, and humiliated. In this distorted emotional landscape, harm no longer seemed unthinkable. It appeared instead as a means to restore order, to silence the unbearable tension that had come to define their lives. The line between thought and action blurred, eroded by months of resentment and unchecked power. The violence that followed was sudden and irrevocable. It did not resemble the dramatic scenes later imagined or whispered about. It was chaotic, fueled by panic and rage rather than calculation. In those moments, consequences ceased to matter. What mattered was ending the conflict, asserting dominance, reclaiming control. When it was over, the silence that followed felt heavier than the argument itself, pressing down with the weight of what could not be undone. Shock set in almost immediately. Reality returned in fragments. The sight of a life extinguished, the understanding that everything had changed, the dawning recognition of permanence. Fear replaced fury as the women grasped the enormity of what had occurred. This was no longer a private transgression that could be rationalized or shared in secrecy. Death had a gravity that demanded reckoning, even in a society skilled at avoiding it. Instinctively, they turned not toward confession or remorse, but toward preservation. Years of privilege had taught them that survival depended on controlling the narrative. DCC. Ons were made quickly, voices lowered once more, plans formed in hushed urgency. The plantation, isolated and accustomed to silence, became an accomplice through omission. Servants were ordered, stories adjusted, movements restricted. The truth was reshaped into something safer, something that could be absorbed by a system designed to protect those at the top. The enslaved man, already burdened by fear and powerlessness, found himself drawn further into the aftermath. He was questioned, watched, measured not for his well-being, but for his usefulness in maintaining the story being constructed. His proximity to the events made him dangerous, a living reminder of what had happened. In the calculus of self-preservation, his life mattered least. Threats were unspoken yet unmistakable, conveyed through tone, through implication, through the ever-present reality of what could be done to him without consequence. Grief, where it existed, was complicated and incomplete. There were moments when one of the women felt a wave of horror at what had been done, an image that returned unbidden in quiet hours. Yet these moments were quickly suppressed, smothered beneath rationalization. Blame was reassigned, responsibility diluted. Each convinced herself that the other had forced her hand, that the outcome, however tragic, had been unavoidable. This self-deception became necessary for survival, a shield against guilt that might otherwise have broken them. Externally, life resumed its familiar rhythm with unsettling speed. Meals were served, guests received, letters written. Mourning, if acknowledged at all, was brief and carefully curated. Society accepted the explanation offered, aided by its own reluctance to probe too deeply into the affairs of the powerful. Questions were discouraged by influence, by reputation, by the discomfort of confronting truths that challenged the moral order people preferred to believe in. The scandal, such as it was, faded into rumor, softened by time and distance. Internally, however, the consequences lingered. The surviving woman, or women depending on the outcome, found that control no longer brought comfort. The sense of invulnerability that had once defined them was fractured. Sleep became troubled, haunted by memories and imagined accusations. Ordinary sounds triggered flashes of fear, reminders that the past could resurface without warning. Even as they maintained their composure, something fundamental had shifted. Power still existed, but it felt brittle, contingent, always at risk of exposure. The enslaved man bore the heaviest, quietest burden. His life continued under the same system that had enabled the tragedy, yet it was irreversibly marked by it. He carried knowledge he could never safely share, trauma he had no means to heal. His silence was enforced not only by threat, but by the understanding that truth offered him no protection. History would not record his suffering, it would pass him by, focused instead on the scandal of elite women and the sensational elements of their downfall. Over time, the story hardened into a version that could be told without discomfort. Details were omitted, motivations simplified, responsibility blurred. In this retelling, jealousy became a footnote, violence an aberration, rather than the product of a deeply unjust system. The broader context, the normalized cruelty of slavery, the unchecked power of privilege, the emotional distortions bred by ownership, was largely ignored. It was easier to view the event as a personal tragedy than as a symptom of something far more pervasive. Yet the legacy of what happened endured in subtler ways. The plantation, once a symbol of stability, became a place shadowed by memory. Those who lived there sensed it, even if they did not know the full story. An unease lingered in certain rooms, in moments of silence that stretched too long. The surviving woman's authority, though still formidable, carried an edge of desperation, as though she were constantly reinforcing it against an unseen threat. In the end, jealousy did turn deadly, not because of a single flaw or moment of madness, but because it was nurtured by a system that rewarded domination and denied accountability. The tragedy was not isolated. It was the natural conclusion of a world where power went unchecked and human lives were reduced to possessions. Those at the center of the story lived on, but they did so diminished, bound to the consequences of an act that could never be fully erased. History remembers such events imperfectly, filtered through bias and omission. Names may survive, whispered as cautionary tales or sensational anecdotes, while the deeper truths remain obscured. What is left is a stark reminder of how easily obsession can eclipse empathy, how privilege can insulate cruelty, and how the most devastating violence often unfolds not in chaos, but in the quiet confidence that one will never be held to account.